Okay, you're recording it now, so
Yeah,
that's fine.
like,
Okay,
yeah, I
thank
can
you.
send you the file that I didn't see where
Great.
to. Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, we're good? Okay.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Sorry about that.
But no problem at all. So the common perception of what is archaeology is based on the idea of Indiana Jones made popular that archaeology is about finding hidden lost treasures. And whenever I give archaeological talks, and this is really still a very common idea of what archaeology is. If you ask what archaeology does, if it's not about digging dinosaurs, it's about going to the pyramids to excavate. And not many people think about archaeology actually being in this region. And so that's one of the things that we as archaeologists that work here in more of a treeless landscape is in working on hunter and gatherer archaeology is try to educate the public and that all the archaeological resources that we do have here in this region. And of course, archaeology definitely is not about digging dinosaurs, although we do study animal remains that we find that's related to people. But this is a very common also misconception of what archaeology is. And we just had a family that just moved in next door, and I told him I worked at the Lubbock Lake Landmark, was an archaeologist, and he's then immediately started talking about some dinosaurs. So this is just a common idea of what archaeology is and something that we try to educate the public about, and also trying to talk about archaeology in terms of what it is in terms of time span. People get the time periods mixed up, you know, dinosaurs being over 60 million years ago, and get that confused with people. Another thing that often comes up, and also unfortunately due to a lot of television shows that are popular, is the idea of archaeology being this great mystery that we're trying to uncover these ancient relics, ancient secrets, and shows are popularized like Ancient Aliens, which is a program on the History Channel. There's other programs on the Travel Channel. And so they make try to make archaeology fanciful in that we're finding UFOs or these hidden secrets that's going to reveal something new to us in our modern day lives. But that definitely is not archaeology, but it's something that we talk about still because it's still a big public misconception about what archaeology is. So what is archaeology? So I like there's a theoretical perspective called behavioral archaeology. And in this definition of archaeology, it means simply the study of material culture in all times and places based on context. And so the idea of that archaeology is only about studying the ancient past is not true. You can also study modern material culture. There's one of the famous examples of that is the Archaeology project was started out of the University of Arizona and looking at people's modern day garbage and trying to get at what they were actually doing rather than what they're saying. So if you give people a survey, they'll tell you what you think they want to hear, like say, how many beers do you drink a week? You know, they may tell you only drink 2 a week, but if you dig through their garbage, it may be actually 10. So the study material culture can give you different types of insights than just asking people and talking to them. So when we talk about material culture, those are the things we make and use. And how we make the things and how we use them is all done within our own cultural practice. And so if you look at the variation in material culture, say like clothing or knives or how, you know, how they're made, what they look like, all have different types of meaning. And if you look at that, you can get at patterns and look at how things were happening in the past. And it's a kind of a simple model to look at material cultures, to look at kind of the chain of views. So you can start off with procurement. How did you get the item, or how did you get the raw material to make the item? So in terms of making stone tools, where did you get the lithic material to make your arrowhead. And then the manufacture aspect of it is, how did you make it? There are different ways to make things. And so if you study how people make things, that can give you insights into their culture. And then how did they use the item? And in what context did they use it? And then finally, where did the item end up? Where did they throw the item away? And that could be very behaviorally significant. For example, if you put some items in a burial, then that may take on a more higher cultural significance versus leaving it at a campsite. And so when we're talking about context, that is the interrelationship between objects and their locations on the landscape. And this is the most critical aspect of archaeology, is that to make strong inferences about what things mean in the past, you really have to know where it was found and what was found around it to really understand what you're looking at. Working at the Lubbock Lake Landmark, there are people that from the public that come and ask me to identify objects, and oftentimes I can't tell them the complete picture because they're not sure exactly where it was found, and I can't give them any more insight. If sometimes the object can be diagnostic, like an arrowhead, I can estimate a time period, but if I don't know exactly where it was found and what else was around it, then I can't really give out that much more information other than that. So some examples that I want to talk about from my own research to kind of highlight the importance of context and documentation, and also a couple tangents of some of the materials that we find here on the Southern High Plains. So my first example is based upon my own dissertation research. It's a Paleo-Indian site that dates over 10,200 years old, the San Patrice Bison Kill site. And I worked on that site back in 2004, 2005. The next example is figuring out the process of heat treating Potter member quartzite, which is a type of lithic material found here on the Southern High Plains. And the hunters and gatherers would heat treat it to improve its how it would flake off, and they can make better stone tools after they were heat treating it. And the third example is a historical site that we did some research on. It's a mid 1880s square and compass historical site. So we'll talk about each of those. So first off, the Howard Gully San Patrice Bison Kill. So I first learned about this site based upon a landowner that brought the projectile point to the Sam Dumble Museum of Natural History in Norman, Oklahoma, where I was doing my graduate research at. And in looking at the projectile point, that notching that you see towards the base, that is a style that you normally only see in eastern Oklahoma or eastern Texas. And also the indentation on the base, kind of making that curve section. And that's a point type normally called San Patrice. And there's only been a few sites found on the western plains of that style. One being the Rex Rogers site up kind of near Canyon, Texas, in the McKenzie Reservoir area. That's been the only documented site, and they did not have a good radiocarbon age for that site. So it was really unclear what the relationship was of this projectile point. But so this site, Howard Gully, is in extreme southwestern Oklahoma. So I went out there to investigate. And so here's a map of kind of the purple bluish dot in southwestern Oklahoma is where the site's at. And the other shapes on there are related to the different lithic material types that you can see in the region. So. Sorry, I'm trying to find my little arrow tool. Well, that's not working. Um, okay, we'll move on to the next one. Okay, so I went there and you can see this excavation. I'm just at the very top of it at this point, the image on the left. And right away, like within the first couple days, I started excavating near where the landowner found the projectile point. I found a second projectile point. And that second projectile point is pictured on the right. And it's a similar style as the first one that the landowner found. As you can see, kind of below there, like in that the lower section of the excavation, you can start seeing some white there. There are some bison bones popping up there. So that was at the very beginning of the excavation. Now, one thing that puzzled me was, what I really wanted was that projectile point right in the center of the bones. So I would know there was had a better association with that bison, but it was only found on the top of them. And this is that same area where I completely excavated the bison feature. And I was able to estimate there were 2 different bison that were left over here. And we had 2 projectile points. And this is the same area and completely excavated way below the bison bone. And that arrow is pointing to buried soil down below, that darker color material. And that buried soil, when we radiocarbon dated that, dated to 10,800 years ago. And we also radiocarbon dated the ear bone of the bison. I was lucky enough to find one of those. In the ear bone of the bison, the petrous bone, it dated to 10,214 thousand years ago. So that provided a direct age for the 2 projectile points. The buried soil below that provided a maximum age. And so those 2 dates kind of collaborated with each other. Excuse me. So, so the really kind of the question about the context that would be questionable is that the projectile points weren't found directly within the bison bone. They were found a little bit on the top, and the landowner found the first one. But I would argue that since the landowner found one, then I found the second one, and there are 2 projectile point types that aren't common to this region. And they're right with the bison bone. That's most likely that they're together and associated with this bison kill. And it's the oldest date for a San Patrice that we have. Excuse me. And so it may indicate that San Patrice could have originated on the Western Plains and then migrated to the eastern Oklahoma and eastern Texas. So that may be a kind of a new insight. People haven't jumped on board with this yet too much in terms of other archaeologists, but it's something that we need to find more sites to collaborate this radiocarbon date, and also this idea that maybe San Patrice originated out west rather than in the east, even though there's more San Patrice points typically found in that region. And so that's the first example of kind of going through all the context. And also the 2 San Patrice points, they're made of Edwards chert, and that's from Central Texas. That's the orange shape you kind of see in the Central Texas on the map. So they got the material from there, made the San Patrice points, and they're all the way then in southwestern Oklahoma. So that's another line of evidence demonstrating that the Howard Gully site is a good and real find. Flip through these real quick. Okay, so like a brief tangent, I was talking about soils. And so soils are really important for archaeologists. And at the Howard Gully site, I wouldn't have been able to interpret it without also interpreting the soils. So a major difference is like thinking about the difference between sediments and soils. So sediments form from bottom up, and that's like you can think about windblown sand, which is really common out here, covering up things and building up over time. or it could be lake and river sediments that build up in a pond situation. Now, soils are different than sediments. They form from top down. And you got to have grass growing on the surface, and then the grass and vegetation, trees, they incorporate organic matter into the ground, and that then makes a soil. And over time, if that soil then becomes buried, and we can then date that buried soil and give us an estimate of what the artifacts associated with that soil date to. So here's my little soil forming graph. So we got some grass on our windblown sediment. And say somebody comes and builds a campfire there on top of that. And so then we have our soil forming, and soils, the very top, the most organic rich material is called the A horizon. The down below the A horizon is called the B horizon, which is clays and some organic material that migrates down the soil profile. It's kind of the transition zone. And then you get the C horizon, which is the unaltered parent material. So then over time, say that soil then gets buried by more windblown sediment. And then we have our modern soil today that then forms a new soil. And then we have a buried soil. And say some archaeologists come by today and then excavate and find the remnants of the campfire in terms of like hearthstones and other material associated with the campfire. They then can date the soil and determine how old it is. Excuse me for my coughing. Okay, so the second example is heat treating Potter member quartzite. So the Potter member quartzite is a really popular rock type that's used for making stone tools on the southern high plains. And you see the red box on the right. There are you don't see any reds in them. And the very outer part of the rock turns red when you put it in a campfire. And if you see on the left, that part is, you see the cortex on the outer side, it's red. And also when you heat treat it, it becomes more lustrous, waxy in color. Now, normally, if you just throw this rock onto a campfire, it will just explode into millions of pieces, and you can't use it to make stone tools. So what archaeologists have discovered normally is that you take smaller pieces of it off, then you bury it underground and build a campfire on top of it, so that then over time you can gradually raise the temperature up slowly, so you don't automatically just start fracturing the material, and then you are able to heat treat it. But if you raise the temperatures up too high, too quickly, it'll just fracture. So we got interested in this material. So I've been working at the post research area, which you can see on the map, since 2007. And there's a lot of Potter member quartzite in this area. And this material type occurs in the basal gravels of the Ogallala Formation, which is right on top of the Triassic red beds. And besides the Potter member quartzites, there's all kinds of different cherts and quartzites and basalts that you can make stone tools out of in this area. And that's a field shot of a knapping station of making some of the Potter member quartzite. But this one is not heat treated. You don't see any of the reds in it. And I'm stepping back really quick. So one of the archaeological sites we're working at, we were finding, do you see the biggest piece of Ogallala quartzite there by the scale bar? If you look, that really big gray rock. We were finding some archaeological sites where that was already heat treated. It was already red. which was really puzzling because normally when you heat treat stuff, you always flake off smaller pieces to heat treat it first. And so the idea was, how were they doing that? Because if you just normally it won't heat very evenly because it's such a big piece. So we did some archaeological experiments to try to recreate how were they doing this by building different types of hearth features to see how the best way to do it was. And so what we came up with was that the best way to heat treat it to get the temperature high enough was to surround a campfire with the Potter quartzite first. And this was critical because it raises the temperatures up slowly. Um, and then after the rocks have been heated somewhat, you can then toss them directly onto the fire to get the effect of the heat treatment. What we found doing the other types of heat treatment practices, if you would dig a pit and put the whole Potter member quartzite and bury it, is that the temperatures would never get high enough to heat treat the nodule. So instead, the only way to get the high enough temperatures is to put it directly on the campfire. But if you did that, normally it would fracture into a million pieces. So if you just ringed it first, then that would bring up the temperature more slowly, and then you put it directly on the fire, and then voila, you can successfully heat treat it, which is actually a lot simpler way to successfully heat treat the rock rather than digging a big pit to bake the rock. And so this is an example. So there's when our experiments, we would take off a flake from the nodule first, and that very top one that says HE4, it's one of our experimental numbers. You can see how the outer cortex of it is more brown. So we took that piece off, and the bottom piece, you see how it's all red? That's the changes that occurred after heat treatment. So we take the flake off first and then bury the rest of it, so then we can compare the changes between the two. And so our new method of heat treating was able to successfully work. And this is the first time I've ever seen in the literature of people heat treating large cobbles right like that. But that was based upon the context of what we're seeing in the field. And then we had to do all the experiments to then generate additional context to figure out how they were doing it, because there's nobody around left that knows how to do this type of method. And so here's my other brief tangent. I've been talking about lithic stone tools. So lithics, unlike a lot of other technologies, is a reductive process. So you take a bigger piece of rock. So the one on the very left is a bigger nodule, and then you break it down into different tools. So you take flakes off, and those flakes can then be made into projectile points, scrapers, and all kinds of different tools, whatever you want. So a rock can be like a Swiss Army knife. You can really make it, craft it, if you know how to flint knap into whatever kind of tool that you need. And so because it's a reductive process, you can find the rocks in different stages across a landscape, and then get movement patterns across the landscape, which then you can really study behavior with that. It provides. But if you don't know where it was found and other pieces with it, then you really don't have any context. So you really need to be able to find these things in situ to be able to look at the whole process. Okay, my last example is the Square and Compass historical site that we worked on. And we started metal detecting here, I think, in 2012. It's also located at the Post research area. And at this site, we found over 1,000 metal objects at this location. And that's a kind of a close-up map of the distribution of the different types of artifacts that we found. You can kind of see the density concentration is right near the gully that you can see there on the map. It's really got everything, wagon hardware, clothing items. We found a lot of firearm related artifacts like cartridges being the main thing. And then if you look toward the right, the little diamond shape icons you see, those are twisted wire that we mapped. And that became in what we call fence hardwire on this map. But that we had a concentration of that, and we were trying to figure out what that meant. And here's some of the objects we found at the site. So the upper left is a coffee grinder that would have been on, attached to like a chuck wagon. Horseshoes, personal items like buttons and belts and suspender clips, spoon, fork, different types of cans. So really a wide range of different things were found at this locality. We found over 200 cartridges, which is a very large amount. Most of them were the 45 long Colt, or 75% of them were, and none of them had head stamps on the end of the cartridge. And I asked one of the experts on cartridges, Doug Scott at the University of Nebraska, and based upon the 45 long Colt not having a head stamp, that indicated that this site likely dated to the mid 1880s, because by the 1890s, most of the cartridges have head stamps. And this is a map showing the distribution of cartridges and bullets that we found there. We were able to map 4 different clusters or 5 different clusters of the cartridges. And also you can see the X's where the bullets were landing. And we're able to figure out that that there were definitely people shooting from the same location. Like there was one of these clusters had like 50, 45 long Colt cartridges in the same spot. So they were definitely shooting from the same location. And also you can note on the other map is this is also where we found all the chuck or the wagon hardware, the horseshoe and everything all kind of in this one location. And this map shows our distribution of fencing material, twisted wire, and all the twisted wire was kind of found, more concentrated by these group of juniper trees away from the heavier concentration area. So what we were thinking about with that, and the landowner stopped by and was looking at our survey and metal detector work, and we're finding all this twisted wire. And we also were finding a type of wire that was it was not barbed wire, it was what they call slick wire. And he said that the slick wire was typically used for horses. You don't use barbed wire when you're pinning up horses. And so there's a wide range of different artifact types found at the site. And so we're puzzled trying to figure out what the site was. We had a lot of things related to like potentially cattle ranching. And we knew based on our historical research at this time in the mid 1880s, it was under square and compass land ownership, which is a cattle ranch. So we're trying to figure out what this all meant. And so then I also got to thinking about where this site was located at in terms of the overall ranch. So we're lucky to know where the square and compass ranch would have been, shown on the map right there. And also our site, the site was called Macy 16, the square and compass site I've been talking about. You can see it's located kind of a distance away there. And then if you plot it out, the distance of our site is about almost 7 miles from the ranch headquarters. And that's kind of got me to thinking about in terms of overall where you're at on the landscape. And when you're trying to move horses and wagons and all the different types of artifacts we found, the different types of cartridges, and then I also did a lot of research on the different types of cattle ranching sites that you would possibly find. So my inference was that this was a cattle roundup site where you would have many different types of cowboys from neighboring ranches coming together to help out on the roundup. Particularly in the mid 1880s, it was vital that everyone helped each other on their roundup so you'd have enough people. And also the idea of the the chuck wagon being there, its position on the landscape, the slick wire, the concentration of slick wire and twisted wire by those trees. Then we interpret that as being a horse remuda, that it's a grouping of horses, and there normally was a cowboy in charge of keeping all the horses together. And that and normally you think of like in the movies, like, you know, a cowboy has just one horse, but when you're doing a roundup, cowboys normally had 2 or 3 horses because they tire out easily. And so then you got that aspect, the chuck wagon. And then another interesting piece of evidence is that, and I have never seen this in the literature, was thinking about all these cartridges found together. So then we interpreted that as maybe they were having a shooting competition between each other, that they were like doing target practice. And if you think about when you get a bunch of different cowboys from different ranches coming together, that there's going to be some competition between them, you know, showing off behavior. And, you know, these are kind of the things that start off, you know, the development of the rodeo, like showing off your skills and doing different things. So all our cartridges, that's what we interpret it as being kind of a friendly shooting competition. Then if you look at some historical photos, these are some photos taken from the early 1900s of a roundup on the same ranch, but later in time. You can see like how everyone is like clustered around the wagons. The top picture, they're stopping for lunch. You know, the wagon's right there, but they're all like shoved in right next to each other. And at the bottom one, there's someone sleeping right there. And if you look at other pictures, everyone like slept right next to each other, or they ate there. And that's what we interpret it as, our very heavy concentration of artifacts of all these different artifact categories found in one spot, is this type of roundup camping behavior. Okay, so that is it for my kind of going over my examples of archaeology, some of the research that we've been doing. So I can unmute everybody and then take any questions about what I was talking about. And also then we can talk about this article.
So anyone have questions? Well, I have a question, Stance. What, let me see, I'll show myself.
Okay.
What years did you say the ranch was operating, do you think?
So the
Square and
square,
compass?
yeah, the square, oh, I'm sorry, the square and compass was from 1881, 82 to 1901.
Okay.
We know that really well from the historical documents. So that's for the square and compass part of it.
Okay, thank you.
What is the oldest site that you know of in North America that they've like dug up human artifacts? Just out of curiosity.
The oldest in, like, if you were counting Alaska, they can go back to like 24,000. Here in the southern part in the continental United States, the agreed upon like oldest that most experts would say would be true is about 16,000. When you go older than that, then there's some sites that are older than that, but those are still controversial.
Huh, interesting.
So definitely, and that's a pretty big jump. Like 15, 20 years ago, we're still like, everyone was still at 12,000 was the oldest, and that being the Clovis time period. But definitely everyone's looking at 16,000.
That's really interesting. I like that.
Mhm.
Mhm.
And so the site I was working on's, a little bit later in time than that, but still old, but not one of the oldest.
Does he know?
Any other questions? Any questions about how we kind of arrived at the logic of interpreting any of these sites?
Did someone direct, like in the first case, you had someone bring an artifact. So is it normally some outside force that alerts you to these locations?
Yeah, oftentimes it is. And like at the post research area, we had a person that was riding motorcycles down there initially and was finding stuff, and got my boss, Dr. Johnson, involved. And so that's how that project started. Often archaeological sites are found through construction, like building a new pipeline or roadway. Sites are often found that way. Probably more rarely is when an archaeologist is walking around the landscape and finds a new site. We have documented a lot at the post research area because it's a pretty big area, but we do purposely walk and survey and look for new sites as well.
Thank you.
And hopefully from my little presentation, you can see from the wide range of time periods, all from 10,200 to the 1880s, historical times. Really, archaeology, you can really look at everything. And the ranching history is really interesting in that there's still documentation and there's still people that live in the region that know about what happened. Like when I gave the example, the landowner coming up and telling us that the slick water was normally used for horses, to pin up horses. That's knowledge that is going to be starting. We're going to start losing that over the next few generations. And so by us doing some archaeology that's not as ancient, we're doing I think a good job of documenting that before we lose a lot of that other information. When we're trying to figure out what happened, 2,000 years ago, it's a little bit more difficult because we don't have all that other historical information to go upon. And all we have are the artifacts and the interrelationship between them to make those interpretations. Any other questions? Okay, well, do you guys have any thoughts about the article that can be emailed everybody? I think it really kind of is a good example of the importance of context and trying to make interpretations. So do you guys think that's a real artifact that made its way all the way from Mexico by indigenous people to Hawaii? Or do you like the author's interpretation that maybe it was a tourist artifact that made its way to Hawaii?
Definitely tourist.
But I haven't seen the episode yet. What this is based upon. I don't know if any of you guys have seen the American Unearthed that it's based upon, but this is a show that's being broadcast on TV that people are watching, that are making claims of these long distance travel of artifacts like this. Does anybody else have any thoughts about it?
Hi, Stance.
Hey, Jordan.
I haven't seen you lecture in a while, so this is nice. I was just wondering if you ever find yourself frustrated being an archaeologist and seeing these kind of shows, or like Indiana Jones, because on the one hand it gives a really romanticized, or however you want to say it, example of what that career is, but on the other hand, like a little 6-year-old seeing it, you know, that might be the thing that like tips them towards archaeology in the future.
Yeah, that's like, and I don't know for sure exactly how much Indiana Jones impacted me wanting to be an archaeologist, but you know, I was a kid growing up in the 80s, and so I can't just totally discount that. I think there's a big difference, though, like, you know, a movie that's, you know, supposed to be more entertaining and kind of fun to see versus a show that's that is supposed to be more like it's more like a factual documentary. Um, I think those are a lot more problematic. I mean, the Ancient Aliens is on the History Channel. So that's really, I think, really problematic. And so people that aren't, you know, the general public that don't read other things and they see these things, it's really carries on this uninformed ideas about the past. But this has been going on, you know, forever. You can go back into um, the first our founding fathers and in America during that time, and some people thinking the mounds that we have in North America was from the lost tribe of Israel, or that Merlin built them. There's all kinds of things that people, fanciful things, ideas that people have come up with to explain some of these things. And you know, you see it in the newspapers. You know, recently when they find a new Mayan site in Guatemala, and they often phrase it in terms of like the ancient Mayans disappeared, even though the Mayans still live there. So there's all these things that still continue. So yeah, it's really tough seeing these types of shows. But I think there are some benefits into like movies like Indiana Jones that are just supposed to be fun. But there can be some problems with it as well. And one trend that you've seen in archaeology and in the broader anthropology over the last 10 years, I've noticed that a lot of people have really gotten into forensics. And, you know, why do you think that is? And that's because of all the different CSI shows that really have populated television in the last decade. Any other questions or thoughts about the article? I think a kind of a cool aspect of the article is that, you know, the odds of this obsidian projectile point being found there is pretty low, and that the idea that's a tourist artifact and that someone carried that all the way to Hawaii, left it there, and then somebody else came and found it and then thought it was important and they sourced it back to Mexico. Those are all pretty low odds for all that to happen. But when you do the science and actually look at the artifact and understand the context, then you can understand the idea that's most likely just a tourist object. And I can make stone tools somewhat. I'm not an expert, but that projectile point is something I could even make, because you just have to kind of grind the sides of it to kind of make a quick shape like that. An expert flint knapper can strike it and take flakes all the way across it.
And so can you tell the difference between one made today by an expert and then one from the past?
That can be extremely difficult. If an expert flint knapper makes it, then that is you. Sometimes you cannot. If they're using like a modern tool to help make it, like a copper billet, and they didn't have copper, normally they would use antler or another stone to shape it. If you can see remnants of the copper on the edge, that could be a giveaway. But if you don't see it, then they can definitely fool you. And so to be able to reliably understand the authenticity of the object, you really got to know where it's from and where, if it was found in context. And
Are there many fraudulent cases?
yeah, definitely. Because it's lawful to sell arrowheads and other objects on eBay, you can make them if you know what you're doing, and then try to sell them as authentic.
Well, I guess I was even thinking from, maybe even scientists doing it for their own reasons, to skew the science and the research in their favor.
Yeah, there hasn't been any that I've seen evidence of that. So if you were going to do that, there's also other documentation that backs up everything you say. So like when you're excavating and you find an object, you take pictures of it in situ, in association with the other objects. So if you're like to purposely try to fake it and plan it, and if it looked like it wasn't buried properly, then that could be questioned. And some of the like very most important sites, they often will invite other archaeologists to come out and look at it to double check if everything's that is correct in the interpretation of it. There have been a few famous hoaxes that have happened in the past, particularly with looking at early human remains. There's a famous case in Britain where they called it the Piltdown Man, where they had like a orangutan jaw on a chimpanzee head put together, and they then tricked some paleontologists to find it, and then the idea was that there was bigger brain early humans in Great Britain versus Africa, and that hoax went unnoticed for like 50 years.
That's right. I heard about that.
Yeah. And there's a lot of debate about who most likely did the tricking, but it was like carried off really well. That took more modern technology to prove it was a hoax. But you do have to, like in the Howard Gully site, like it's just one site so far, so you got to have more than one. You just can't just have the one. So you got to have multiple lines of evidence, and to really like make accurate interpretations of the past and present too of material culture. Any other questions? I do apologize for my coughing through talking. I'm still trying to get over my coronavirus I had about 4 weeks ago.
Oh,
We appreciate it, Stance.
Yeah. And sorry I had to cancel beforehand.
That's okay. It's a Corona year. Everything happens.
Yeah.
and this
Yep.
thing,
I'm
I just don't have
feeling better.
of a background in it, so it's all really new to me. So I don't even really know what to ask. So thank you very much.
Oh, that's okay. And it's a little bit more, I much prefer to be doing this in person where we can interact. It's really hard on Zoom, particularly when we don't really know everybody,
Yeah,
Mhm.
it is hard.
Yeah,
you so
thank you.
much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
But you're at the landmark, right? So we'll probably, when we finally are turned loose, we'll probably be able to see you in person.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'd be more than happy to talk about something else or something more specific or, yeah.
All right. Thanks,
Thank you.
Stance.
Thank
Yeah.
you very
Th-
Mhm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, until we see each other in person.
All right.
Mhm.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Sure was good.